Let's say we were asked to solve the equation x squared equals -1. And we've learned a couple different methods we can use to solve a quadratic, but I want to try plugging in numbers and just kind of thinking our way through the answer. So, if I plug in a positive number for x, I'm going to get a positive squared, which is going to give me a positive answer. That's not going to work out because my answer in this problem is negative. So we know for sure that x can't be a positive number. If x is actually a negative number squared is still equal to a positive. So x can't be a negative number either. So it can't be positive, it can't be negative. I guess we can try 0, but 0 squared equals 0. None of the numbers we know work in this problem. So any number you could possibly think of, if you square it, it's not going to be a negative answer. So if you were to come across this problem in Algebra 1, we'd be having a big issue right now. If we were to use our square root method that we learned this year in Algebra 2, we would get x equals plus or minus square root of -1, which is still an issue. You can't take the square root of a negative number. So again, if you were to come across this in Algebra 1, what you would have done is you would have said no real solutions and maybe put our traditional empty set symbol, the 0 with a line through it, and we would have been done with it, stopped there. And that's a totally fine way of doing it. But as you get into more advanced math classes, we're going to introduce in this video a new set of numbers. So back a couple hundred years ago, somebody looked at this problem and said, hey, what if there actually was a number out there that when you squared it, you got a negative? So they just kind of made up a number. They thought, okay, let's say there was some number that if you squared it, you get a negative. Or sorry, yeah, if you get a negative. And they called that number lowercase I. So they said that I squared equals -1. I itself is equal to the square roots of -1. So what they did is they said, okay, let's say there's this number square root of -1, that when you square it, it equals a -1. Now this seems really weird. It will when you see this video, and it's not going to make much sense. Like, you can't take the square root of a negative. I can't process what's going on here. I kind of think about this like when you guys were younger and you first learned about fractions, or you first learned about negative numbers. At first it would have been really weird for you and you wouldn't have known what was going on exactly. It's the same sort of thing here. We're learning about a whole new system of numbers, and it's going to be weird at first. It's going to be strange to think about, and it's hard to wrap your head around. But they're saying there's a number, the square root of -1, that when you square it, you get a negative answer. This little box right here is extremely important. This is something to memorize. I itself is equal to the square root of -1, and I squared is equal to -1. So, all I'm going to do in this video, this is a new type of number called an imaginary number. I is an imaginary number. And we're going to practice doing different operations with imaginary numbers. We might add two imaginary numbers together, or subtract two imaginary numbers, or multiply them, or do all different sorts of things with them, just like we would do with regular numbers. So, this video is just going to focus on simplifying them. So we're learning about this new system of numbers here, which I'll explain in more detail in class. But this video is going to focus on simplifying imaginary numbers. So let's say we had something like the square root of -20. So if you saw this problem in Algebra 1, you'd be like, -1 under the square root doesn't make sense. I can't do it, I'm done. But now, we're going to recognize this as an imaginary number. So I want you guys to write down an imaginary number. The easiest way to think about it is an imaginary number is a number with a negative under the square root. This isn't the perfect definition, but it's a good starting point. So a number with a negative under the square root. So if we have the square root of a negative, what we can do is split this square root up into two separate pieces. I can do the square root of -1 times the square root of +20. If you have a square root, you're allowed to split it into these two separate pieces like that. If you multiply those together, you still get -20. So I'm going to do a little factor tree on 20, and I'm going to break it to 2 and 10, and 2 and 5. I have a pair of 2's. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So 2 and 10 to the 20 is 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the 20. So this is going to be 2 times 10 to the root 5 times this square root of negative 1 over here. Well, square root of negative 1, remember, that's just equal to I. That's our new imaginary number that you're going to have to memorize. So it's going to be I times 2 root 5, which I'm just going to rewrite as 2I root 5. So this is the simplified version of this. I'm going to do one more example in this video. Let's say my problem was the square roots of negative 45. Again, you're going to start out by splitting it into two pieces. Put the negative off by itself, because that's the weird part, and we're going to leave the plain old positive number that we know how to deal with. You always just take the negative, throw it in its own little square root sign, and leave this guy alone. Positive version. We're going to do a factor tree on 45 right now and break it down. And when you do that, it turns out it's going to be 3 root 5. This square root of negative 1 is going to turn into an I, and I'm going to get 3I root 5. So the basic idea, if this part is kind of confusing for you, you can just think about it as ignoring the negative sign. Pretend the negative sign isn't there, and just do a factor tree on the positive number, and then you basically just put an I on your answer. So for example, if I did the square root of negative 9, well, the square root of positive 9 is 3, so this is just going to be 3I. You just do the square root like normal, simplify it, and just put an I on your answer to show that it is imaginary.